All right, time for our Tuesday dose of common sense with host of Outsiders and editor at The Spectator magazine, Rowan Dean.
How are you, Peter? Great editorial.
I'm well. Well, do you think I'm wrong there on public servants?
No, you're 100% correct. And the point that you're making, which you were diplomatic in making, is that the public service have always swung to the left, or certainly in the last few decades. So the problem is when Tony Abbott came in 2013, with Scott Morrison recently, they're not interested. They've got their own agenda. They've got climate change, they've got letting in refugees, they've got the whole left-wing agenda. And this isn't just Australia, by the way. You look at Britain, where the entire public service are Remainers through and through. You look at the States, where Donald Trump has said, we need to drain the swamp for the same reason, that you rely on the public service to implement the policies, and yet completely... The mindset of the public servants is we're going to do it our way because the government will be gone in 3 years.
Correct.
And we know that even in Scott Morrison's government, there are ministers who are being sabotaged, who are being backgrounded against, who the public service are going slow on and not letting them implement the policies that they believe they were elected to. And just to your point about the public servants running their own agenda, the most senior public servant, the head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, he's now moved on, but he was brought in when Tony Abbott was replaced, Martin Parkinson, by Malcolm Turnbull.
Tony Abbott sacked him, I might underscore that point, but
Absolutely.
Malcolm brought him back, yes.
Absolute climate change aficionado. He'd been Kevin Rudd's climate change man. He introduced into the public service, you mentioned running your own agenda, he introduced the idea, the concept of unconscious bias. Now, this is a very left-wing idea that people who have white privilege, and therefore when they look at two people sitting opposite them in a meeting, will automatically choose the white person rather than the non-white person, or the man rather than the woman, or the straight person rather than the gay person, because they suffer from bias.
Sorry to interrupt you, Rowan, there, but of course he doesn't say unconscious bias in and amongst the Canberra public service, which, you know, to every man and dog are basically left-wing people. Every one of those seats, as I said, those lower house seats, there's never any jeopardy that the Libs will win those seats. So he never introduces concepts of unconscious bias in relation to politics. It's all the other causes.
Exactly. And therefore, so you have this public service setting their own agenda, and I don't remember the Australian public ever voting for unconscious bias or any of these mad left-wing ideologies. And that's the problem that Scott Morrison has belled the cat. He's called it out. Let's hope he now follows up. And they've got to weed out those public servants that are not delivering on the government's agenda.
Look, it gave me heart that Scott Morrison is determined to be a long-term PM. You don't turn up the tables down the hill, where there will be ramifications. Public servants have a lot of information and it gets into the public domain. And it's not always public servants, I know, but a lot does get leaked from them. So he's obviously determined that he's going to get his policies implemented and he's going to have some pretty radical changes right across the board. So it gives me heart.
Absolutely.
He sees himself as a long-term proposition. Coming into New South Wales, we've had advice earlier this afternoon that the Premier has started to listen. Now, whether or not she can achieve anything, it's technically a bill of conscience, but she is not wanting anything to happen in terms of a vote this week. I spoke to Natasha McLaren-Jones, she's a Liberal in the Upper House, on the committee that's looking into this bill, along with Mark Latham and others. 48 hours in and around last Friday and Thursday, there were 13,000 submissions. Now, on the issue of greyhounds, there were just over 1,000 submissions. So people are exercised, and whether you want the laws to stay the same, whether you want them to be stronger or weaker, whatever your position is, people just want to be heard. And this is the problem with the Premier.
Yeah, and she's done the right thing, slow down the process, and they have to make changes. It's that simple. We talk about common sense, and the most common sense approach to abortion is that once you're into the later terms, the latter parts of it, you're dealing with a life, you're dealing with a human being. So it's a whole different set of rules to when at the beginning of the pregnancy you're talking about groups of cells and so on. And this has not really been taken into account. These laws simply say, oh, well, yes, two doctors can say abort the baby up until the moment of birth. Most common sense people, for any reason, just go, you have got to be kidding. Now, what happened in the past is irrelevant. And, of course, you don't want women being criminalised for having an abortion. No one wants that, and no one's arguing that. And as far as I'm aware, that has, if ever, hardly ever happened. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the death of babies in the womb or just before birth, and that is unacceptable. This is much, much bigger than greyhounds, because you're talking about people's beliefs,
life. I do think it debases it when people say it's her greyhounds moment. I think it's a whole lot worse than that.
It's much bigger.
And that polling out yesterday, 80% of people on the left and the right, Labor voters are in the poll as well, obviously, self-identified, of course, but the Galaxy poll, I think it's pretty reputable. 80% of people don't want to see late-term abortions in New South Wales, and almost 70%, 68.9 I think it was. Sorry, that was same-sex, sex selection terminations. Yeah. But almost 70% don't want late term. So overwhelming numbers that tell the Premier she's got to slow down this issue and listen.
Absolutely.
Religious freedom.
Yes.
Now, there was a big debate in and around the issue of same-sex marriage for there to be protections. And Malcolm Turnbull promised them. He is long gone now, and still the laws have not been enacted. How is this going to play out, Rowan? Because we know it was discussed in Cabinet today.
Well, you mentioned Malcolm Turnbull. One of the most deceitful actions ever, I still remember it clearly, is when he stood in front of the cameras and said, hand on heart, religious freedom is more important to me than anything, which was complete nonsense, because they then steamrolled it ahead with the whole same-sex legislation without giving it another thought. So a massive lie, massive betrayal of the people. And I think it's that sort of betrayal of all people, but Conservatives as well, that has led to, for example, the abortion. People are fed up with being lied to by politicians who they put their trust in. And Turnbull was a classic of that. But the problem we now have is we're looking at the whole thing the wrong way around. We're looking at it in terms of anti-discrimination legislation. Now, the moment they started bringing in anti-discrimination legislation for all sorts of things, race, so on, gender, going back decades, human rights, the problem was you were setting up special groups of people to be protected. And that's what anti-discrimination law is all about. Now, the problem is that the next mob want to be protected as well, and then the next mob want their protection, and then the next mob want their protection. But these groups are in conflict, and that's the problem. So how do you prioritise when you're protecting the gay person or the gay rights person or whatever it might be? They want their protection, so anti-discrimination legislation. But if your fundamental belief, your fundamental religious belief is, for example, that homosexuality is wrong, to say, take the Israel Folau case, well, you've got two competing anti-discrimination rules. Who takes precedence? And this is what they are not going to be able to solve by just putting layer upon layer of further anti-discrimination legislation.
I agree with you, but the Conservative lawyer in me is also very uncomfortable with a positive rights agenda, that if we went down the path to create rights for religious freedom,
you're allowed to do it, exactly.
That they would, some religions have things that we would consider untenable, like child marriage, like female genital mutilation.
Absolutely.
So are we going to end up then sanctioning those by way of religious rights when they're an anathema to an Australian community? And I also don't support a Bill of Rights. So is a religious freedom right, as opposed to dealing with the discrimination question, is that the first salvo in a new Bill of Rights debate, which
probably will be. And this is the problem. This is our forefathers had this all worked out. This ain't new, any of this stuff. And the Western democracy is built upon the idea, less government, the absolute principle of freedom of conscience, freedom of the individual to do what they believe in, to say what they believe, to express the ideas they believe in. That is what our civilization is built on, but we've then layered on these new regulations, and all we're doing is making it harder and harder for ourselves to get back. What we should be doing, and I've been saying and many others have been saying, just get rid of AT&C, for example. Start dismantling this huge apparatus of anti-discrimination legislation, which is causing all the problems. Get back to the simple idea of freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Yes, there will be people who are offended, but let society, let the social mores say, no, actually, we like what that person is saying. We don't like what that person is saying. Yeah, our opinions are going to go for that. That is how society works successfully. But once you bring in lawyers, and, you mentioned being a lawyer, once you say, oh, well, your right has a legal attachment, which, by the way, a hefty bill will come with that to support that, we've created this structure. It's a nightmare. We should be dismantling it, not adding to it.
Yeah, and there's a sense, Rowan, I'll leave it here, but there's just a sense that there's so much social change being pushed at people at the moment that is not taken to an election where they don't feel like these issues have been ventilated. They don't feel that the ordinary person in the communities and suburbs and towns of this country have had their say. That's the real worry for all levels of government.
Absolutely.
I think. Yeah, Rowan Dean, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Peter.